How's it going?
Hey, very good, Benjamin. How are you?
I am good.
Hey, so I had a quick question for you
Yes.
before. So if I'm sharing the presentation
Mhm.
from my computer, John's still going to have the opportunity to talk, right? So if I control the slides, we don't have to kind of keep switching back and forth,
No,
correct?
yeah, it'll be the panelists can all speak regardless.
Perfect.
No. And you already have 15 participants on, so people are jumping in.
Woohoo.
All right, so I'm going to share the presentation now just to make sure we're good to go.
Mhm.
Nice vest, John.
Yeah, it makes it official.
Does it? Welcome to Winter Mountaineering School 2021.
I didn't get my name tag in the mail. I just got some Tyvek.
You know, I can only do what I can do.
Yeah, that was going to be my big get this year was the vest. I'm disappointed that I'll have to wait till next year to be able to go red.
Wait, did we not put a vest on you last year?
No, the one that you had left was like a medium, and the last time I checked, that wasn't a medium.
You know, just because your personality's an extra large doesn't mean you are too.
Well, I will be lurking here, guys. So if you guys need help with any tech support, I'll be around.
Okay.
You said
Lurk
we have
away.
15 followers. Does that mean they're hearing what we're saying right now?
Yes.
Okay, so we should dial it in a little bit. Mm. I watched one of these recently, and while they were waiting for everybody to log in and the show to start, they had a really cool video playing in the background with nice music.
That will be for the next session.
Yeah, I'll get right on it. I don't know how they did it, but I'll get right on it.
I think WMS has a YouTube channel. You could probably queue up something from there.
Queue up our YouTube.
I believe we have one. Like Alyssa used to post to that regularly.
We could use a bunch of our pictures and kind of have them playing through. Oh, that's way better.
Still daylight out there.
A little bit for a few more minutes.
I just lost the sun about 30 minutes ago.
Did you?
Yeah.
We've got some more snow on the way too. Nothing like the East Coast. Which it would be nice to have a couple feet of snow coming, but we do have a foot coming tomorrow night or tonight or something in the next 24 hours.
Oh. There's no such thing as too much snow.
Mm-mm. No, I'll take it. Bring it on.
It's the best time to hike, best time to get out in the woods.
Yep.
Here it makes the skiing nice.
Yeah, it definitely helps on the skiing side of things.
I actually I went to work today and got ready. I've got to start on Friday. Finally.
Nice. It's a late start to the ski season.
Well, we didn't get snow for 3 weeks. We got a good amount in November, and then we had a 3-week dry spell out here. And so we've been impatiently waiting. Give it one more minute and then we'll get started.
Right. It's almost 6 o'clock. I believe we have people from 4 different states on the panel right now.
We are in, but only 3 time zones.
Yeah, it's hard to get that central one.
Not so many mountains, you know?
No.
All right. Well, we've got 29 folks on now, but it is 8 o'clock on the East Coast, so I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Osborne. I am the current director of Winter Mountaineering School. This is our first presentation of our winter series in lieu of our more traditional program that we run out of the High Peaks area, out of the lodge, and then we also run a trip out of the White Mountains as well. Usually we do in the end of January, beginning of February, our High Peaks section, and then in March we do our White Mountains section. However, with COVID this year, we are 100% online. A little bit about us is we are all volunteer staff. Some of us have been doing this for decades. A couple folks have been only doing this for a few years. Tonight you have Michael Blair, who's been, this is his second season instructing with us, but he's been an AMC instructor for many, many years. And John Booth, who's been an instructor for, I think, a decade or so. And then this is would have been my, I don't know, 9th or 10th, something like that, year, 8th, 9th, 10th, something. But anyways, we're running this winter. So if you're tuning into a bunch of these, welcome to the first one. And I'm going to turn it over to Michael Blair and John Booth, with the other caveat of saying, I'll be on the whole time monitoring the Q&A section. So if you have some questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A area. And then once the guys are done presenting, we'll get to as many questions as we can. So go for it, guys.
All right, John, you were up first.
Unmute. Hi. Thanks for the introduction, Jeremy. My name is John Booth. As he mentioned, I've been an instructor with WMS for 10 years now. It's been a great time. I'm kind of missing seeing everyone in person this year, but this is the best we can do given the situation. So just like anything in mountaineering, you kind of adapt to the situation as it comes at you. So we're happy to be here and talking to you live from. I'm in Colorado. I believe Michael's in Massachusetts.
Yep,
And a little bit of background about myself. I mentioned I was doing this for 10 years. I'm also a long distance hiker on the Appalachian Trail and in PCT, CDT, those types of things. So I hike year round. I also am into a little bit of rock climbing, ice climbing, and getting into some shenanigans in the snow on skis, and hopefully not finding any cornices or post holes. So, Michael, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Michael Blair. I'm with the AMC's Boston chapter. But as Jeremy said, I got involved in winter mountaineering school last year as kind of a way to extend my season, so to speak. I'm a field instructor. I've been a field instructor for 10 years at the AMC's Mountain Leadership School. I hike almost exclusively in the Northeast, made many trips out to New York, the New England states, climbed most of the things that are tall in winter multiple times. And, just to echo the sentiments that both Jeremy and John talked about with the class being online, it's one of the challenges of trying to present this virtually when all of the material and all of our experiences are geared towards like that hands-on approach. So, hopefully you'll get enough out of today to get you started. And, we'll talk later about all the different sessions that we've got coming up, and hopefully you can participate in some of those. So I'll turn it back to you, John.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So I just was going to start off with the presentation here. This is Introduction to Trip Planning. So just to make sure you're in the right place, you're not looking for a different topic. This is the first of many in the series, and also the first of two in the trip planning curriculum, we'll call it. There is an advanced trip planning. I believe it's February 3rd or so. It's a Wednesday. So we'll cover some high-level topics here in regards to trip planning as it pertains to winter trips. This isn't necessarily assuming you have experience with planning trips in the summer, but the approach is basically the same. There's just a few additional elements to consider. So with that, I'll say the goal of every trip into the wilderness is to have a great time and then to come back and be able to tell others about it. So, if you have a story that involves a search and rescue or some other drama, it sounds interesting, but it's not the best way to enjoy the outdoors. And really, this whole trip planning is the first principle of the 7 principles of Leave No Trace, which is plan ahead and prepare. So we can set ourselves up pretty nicely to not just go into the mountains and be successful, but also do it safely and have fun while doing it, and not having to worry about our margin of safety, or if we're going to get through this okay, et cetera. So, and we're going to talk about the various hazards and risks associated with trips into the mountains, specifically in winter, and how to mitigate some of those by managing them before and during the adventure. So what slide are we on now? And then so we kind of have 5 main points there. We'll cover the overall planning from idea to and concept to execution and reality. And then Michael's going to jump into clothing and gear. I'll talk a little bit about nutrition and hydration. There is a separate, more advanced webinar for that. I believe that's at the end of this month, actually, December 30th. We'll definitely touch on nutrition, hydration from a high level, and then we'll kind of bring it all together with the overall, how it all comes together for the trip. Be safe and have fun. And then at the very end, I'll cover what is often forgotten is after you return home from your trip, now what? Because there's a few other steps there that are beneficial to your future success in the mountains. Okay, next.
So I'll start the part of the planning off and talk about taking that idea and turning it into reality. John mentioned the fact that we're primarily focusing our our approach or our content towards winter planning, but a lot of the same principles apply. Obviously, hazards are different, conditions are different. So you'll be able to use what we talk about here for your 3 season as well. And the other point I wanted to make is that as we go through this, this isn't necessarily the only way that you can you kind of look at a trip and plan out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and whatnot. You'll develop your own style. We're going to hit on the key points that you want to make sure are part of that process that you use. But the thing I wanted to just mention is that, regardless of whether it's your first trip or your 100th trip, a lot of these same things are going to apply equally. You may be more comfortable with how you get the information, and your trips may become more complex, but the steps are really going to be relatively similar as you go through the entire process. The big disclaimer, and John hit on it, was, no matter how well you plan your trip, getting up is great, but you need to get back to your car. So, while we're not going to talk specifically about a lot of detailed risk management, wilderness risk management type of decisions, one of the things that as you plan your trips, this obviously has to be your number one goal, is that you want to get back to where you started in the same shape or close to the same shape that you left. There will be a session later this year that does focus on the wilderness risk management piece that I'll be running, but that will be a much more detailed look at the whole risk management approach and how you want to do things. So let's talk about the planning prompts. And I try to keep it as simple as I can, and I just use the basic who, what, where, when, how, and why when I sit down and try to think of a trip. We'll talk about some of the specific elements that kind of fit into each one of these questions, but because you do it over and over again, you want it so that you can repeat it. And so the more simple it is, the easier it will be to keep doing it. And then most importantly, you'll be able to recognize a situation when you may skip a step by accident or inadvertently, and realize like, hey, I didn't kind of figure this out. I need to go back and do it. So you want this process to be something that you do every time that you go through it. You don't want to skip any of the steps. The more detailed the plan is, the better it will be once you get out into the field. The easier it will be to execute, but also the more ready you will be to adapt to changes that may occur either at the trailhead, getting to the trailhead, once you're out on trail itself. You'll have a better understanding of where you're at, and so you'll be able to come up with better decisions or choices to respond to changes in the environment. So we talked about getting back is your number one objective. In winter, there's an additional objective, and that is you want to make sure that your plan is focused on keeping you warm and dry. And so we'll talk about how that comes into play with some of the different prompts. We'll talk about a little bit when we talk about clothing and gear. We'll also hit on how you can stay warm when we talk about hydration and nutrition. So we want to make sure that you're getting back and you're staying warm and you're staying dry. So let's take a look at the first 3 prompts with respect to that setup. And I kind of group these 3 together: the what, the where, and the why. And then while it may seem obvious when you're putting a plan together, the first questions that you ask yourself about what you're going to do, what your capabilities are, is it something that you'll enjoy, or is it something for some other reason, like maybe you're dead set on grabbing a particular peak because you want to check a list off and say, hey, I was there. Those questions of what you're going to do kind of form the foundation of all of the other questions that you'll ask as you go through the planning process. And one of the key things to keep in mind when you are putting a plan together, and we talked about the getting back is mandatory. If you're in the summer months and you end up spending an unplanned night out in the woods, it's likely going to be uncomfortable, or it could be uncomfortable. You have that same situation in the winter. It could turn into a very different different results. So you want to make sure that you're not making any of those mistakes. So you want to make sure that you're comfortable with what you're going to be doing in the winter conditions. And so, not knowing what everyone's background is, I'm going to kind of start with a very basic piece of it. And if you're just starting out in winter, and I know that at least in the New England area, a lot of people got out during the pandemic and experienced the outdoors and are now trying to extend their season into winter. If you've never hiked in winter, the best suggestion that I can make is you want to start low and local. You want to go someplace that you're familiar with, because everything that you do in winter takes more time. It takes more time to get ready at the trailhead. It takes more time to travel along the trail. It takes more time to do gear changes or clothing changes. It takes more time to eat, go to the bathroom, whatever you're doing out there. It takes more time. So if you go someplace where you're familiar with the area, that will help you focus more on what you're trying to learn or become more comfortable with from a perspective of winter exposure than worrying about where's the trail, where's the next turn, what do I need to look for. So start close to home, start with something that is maybe might be a little easier for you on the mental, from mentally you might think it's a little bit easier, but in winter everything is a little bit harder. You want to push yourself, right? So you don't want to do easy stuff all the time, but you want to be able to be honest with yourself and know that I've kind of pushed the envelope to the point where I feel comfortable, and learn from that, kind of come back and then go back out and do a little bit more. Don't want to see somebody who's never hiked in winter say, I'm going to go do a 3-day trip into the wilderness and I'm going to winter camp. There's so much that you need to learn along the way. You kind of want to do it sequentially. So start incrementally, start local, start small, and work your way up, kind of continuing to build on your previous experiences. And so I talked about the difficulties or the time demands of everything in winter taking more time. So you want to set realistic goals. I talked about the mileage. Don't overdo it. Just because you can do 8 to 10 miles in the summer, not necessarily going to be the same in the winter. If you're in snowshoes, you're using different muscles. You're going to get sore in places that you didn't realize that you had muscles in the, because you don't use them in the summer. So you want to set realistic goals, both from a distance perspective, an elevation perspective, and even a time perspective, because days are shorter, right? Right now it's dark. In a couple of months, it's going to be light out still. So you want to make sure that you're taking all this into account. So we'll talk about the next step in the process. And it's another one that seems relatively obvious, is the how are you getting there? And, in winter, it's not always as easy as it is in the summer, because roads will open or close, or gates will open or close seasonally. For example, I just saw a notification the other day that the gate on Corey's Road is closed now for the winter. It'll be opening up again, I think, end of March. And so why is that important? Well, if you're planning to go do any one or all of the Sewards, getting to the gate at Corey's Road and realizing that it's closed now adds 3 miles each way to your trip. And so all of the plans that you've put together can be severely impacted by the fact that in winter, sometimes roads or access is closed or limited. Last year, the gate was open. And so you need to kind of stay on top of that. And that's part of that planning process. I know me personally, I tried to take advantage of when gates are open versus when they're closed, because if I can do anything to kind of cut back some of that extra mileage, I definitely want to. Sometimes roads aren't going to be plowed, especially after a storm. Same for parking lots. So the picture that I'm sharing on the screen is it's a trip that a friend and I did up in Maine, and it's a backwoods logging road where we spent 4 hours the day before just trying to find an access point where, one, we could get to, and two, we could park the car somewhere safe so that it wouldn't be in the traffic flow. And so sometimes, you need to figure out where you're going to park to get to a trailhead, just as much as what are you going to do once you get to that trailhead, and what you're going to do once you're out on trail. a couple of last things about the how you're going to get there that I think a lot of people overlook, and that is your vehicle itself. And I'm not going to teach you how to drive safely in the winter, but I know that during the winter months, it's great to have a set of jumper cables, a shovel. I've got some foldable or folding metal traction devices I can put under my tires. I always put snow tires on my car. I winterize it because I know that I'm going to be going to places that tow trucks don't typically travel to. In this situation, I'm the only car there, so jumper cables aren't really going to do me much good. So I also throw in a battery pack, a portable battery pack that I got through Amazon for like $50 that I can hook up to my battery in case it doesn't start, because that's probably one of the worst fears in winter. You come back, it's cold, you're wet from sweat or snow, and your car doesn't start. And in this case, we're probably 25 miles away from the nearest road, and that is not a walk I wanted to add to the hike that we already did. So, make sure your car is ready for winter. Seems simple, but it's something that we tend to overlook sometimes. So, when are you going to go? And so, we talk about winter, but really winter is it's a long period of time where the season has different characteristics. So, early in the winter, weather's a little less predictable. Daylight is obviously shorter, but it's still important that you stay warm and dry. So when you go and what you're going to encounter plays an important part when you start to lay out the plan for what you're going to do. The picture on the screen is a trip in December to Katahdin. We went right after Christmas. We were the first ones in the park. So we knew that we were going to have to break trail throughout the entire trip. And much like I was talking about with Corey's Road, the Katahdin Park system closes their roads. So to get to the summer trailhead, it's a 14-mile hike in just to get to the summer trailhead. You typically pull sleds with all of your winter gear. But in this case, you're looking at early winter, very unpredictable. The day before was a blue sky day. We had to clean the sign off in this picture just so that we could see it. But we knew that when we were going to go, which was December 27th, that no one had been in the park before us and that we were going to have to do the work. So we adjusted our plans accordingly. Also, with that unpredictable weather, during a storm, if it's snowing on you, it's harder to stay warm and dry because the snow is going to make you wet. You can have the best gear imaginable, but if the weather is not cooperating, sometimes Mother Nature, gets to win. If you're going out right after a storm, you also have that same potential to get, wet and cold because the snow on the trees hasn't been knocked off the branches yet, or you're going to be traipsing through deep snow. This particular picture, the snow getting up to there was up to our knees, even with snowshoes. So you want to make sure that the wind part of it is more daylight. So keep that in mind. The wind you're going to go. And then this last one of the prompts is the who's going to go with you. And I saved this one for last because I think, while it's good if you're the trip planner, right? Whether it's a formal or an informal trip, you want to, if you can, incorporate the people that are going to be going with you in the planning process. You really can't decide who's going to go with you until the plan is finally hammered out. You want to make sure that everyone that's going to go with you is compatible, right? You don't want to be out in the middle of the wilderness in a difficult situation and realize that you're with somebody that has either a different risk tolerance than you do, has other shortcomings from the perspective of working together as a team. So you kind of want to make sure that your plan is in place before you go and try to figure out who's going to go with you. I have a core group of friends, and one of them is in this picture that, I know that I would go anywhere on the planet with them that, we're capable of going. So find that group of people that have similar skills, similar abilities, similar interests, even a similar risk tolerance. And, those are the people that you want to go out with. You don't want to plan a trip where you've got very different levels of who's going to be there, because those conflicts can play out if weather changes or conditions change, and you've got to come together and work together as a team. If not everyone's kind of on the same page with what the plan, what the expectations are, that can be a challenge and can obviously lead to a trip failing, but it can also obviously lead to something far more serious. The last thing I'll say on who's going with you, kind of one of the rules of thumb that you want to think about is group size should be 3 people or more. That way, if something does happen, somebody can stay with the person who had something happen to them, while another person can go get assistance. So 3 is probably the minimum that you should travel with in most situations. And then more isn't always better. Bigger groups will tend to move slower, and that can create its own situations. If you're above tree line or you're in a difficult weather situation, moving slow isn't necessarily what you want to do. So there's a fine line of who's going to go with you, but also how many people are going to go with you. I've had friends say, I want as many that can go as possible because I want them to help break the trail. Well, I found that too many people, doesn't break the trail as well, because you tend to have other issues that come up. So a couple last slides before turning it back to John. Where do we get this information? And John's going to talk about some of the specific things that you're going to want to factor into your plan. But there's nothing better than getting the basic information from whatever the current edition of a local trail guide and map for the area that you're going to travel to. The Adirondack Mountain Club has a series of books out there. On the screen, I'm showing just the High Peaks trails and the Catskills trails, but they've got a number of other books that are out there that you can definitely use. There's a wealth of information in there that you can take a look at and give you ideas about what the route can be, what some of the hazards might be, what you can do to, from a plan standpoint, to either avoid the hazards altogether or at least mitigate them to a point where you feel comfortable. The 2 items on the right are some online planning tools. I use both of those. CalTopo and Gaia both have a computer-based or a web-based interface where you can go online and you can plan and lay out your route. And then if you have a GPS, you can transfer that route to your device and have it with you. A GPS doesn't replace the maps, but it's a great complement if you have a GPS to go with the maps, especially in situations where low visibility is. But you don't want to rely on a GPS if you're in the backcountry. If you don't know how to use a map or don't know how to use a compass, getting out from a problem when your GPS dies or the batteries don't work can definitely lead to some increased risk that you or your group will face. And then the last thing from a resources, and I just did a bunch of screenshots on here. There are all sorts of resources that are available now on the internet. The Department of Environmental Conservation has a website that is updated on a regular basis, and they also send out a weekly newsletter that has all sorts of information related to the High Peaks region, but it also extends out to some of the other areas. In the center of the page, there's a picture of the Adirondack High Peaks Forum, and then in the lower right, there's a Catskill Mountaineer Forum. Those are 2 online forums where people will engage with others, ask questions, answer questions about different routes or different pieces of equipment that you might be thinking about. So very interactive. There's some Facebook groups. I threw a couple of them up there. For weather, I use the National Weather Service. It's weather.gov. If I go in there and in the search bar, I type in the mountain name, the mountain peak name, it will give me a forecast for the specific area that I'm traveling to. And then the last one I wanted to share with you is in the lower left. And while the website's name is Trails NH, it was developed by a friend who hikes here in New Hampshire. He also has expanded that website, so it's trailsnh.com, where he captures information from people's blogs, Adirondacks High Peaks Forum, the Catskill Mountaineer Forum, and gives you information about what recent conditions are with respect to a particular mountain or a particular route. So don't let the name Trails NH fool you. There is some New York based information available on each of those sites. So I'm going to turn it to John now, who's going to take you through some of the different trip parameters and more of the specific stuff that you want to think about when you put your plan together. So here you go, John.
Cool. Thank you, Michael. Before I jump into this slide, I did see a question or comment pop up, so I'll just address that. It looks like, to reiterate your point, just to depend on the manual tools like a printed map and compass. Don't depend on electronics because they're not compatible with cold and wet, and there's plenty of both of those in the Adirondacks in the winter. Okay, so jumping into this is we'll talk a little bit about environmental and route conditions. So once you've decided where you want to hike and when, that Michael's already talked about, you need to do some research using the resources that he just reviewed to answer questions to these 12 variables. So because these 12 items are going to depend on how you pack, what gear you bring. They're also going to depend on what skills you might need to learn or know. And so to get this information, you'll consult government data like the National Weather Service website, backcountry rangers. If you're already out in the mountains and the woods, they're a great source of information. Trail associations. I know, for example, the Northville Placid Trail, which runs through the southern and western Adirondacks, does update their website somewhat regularly with trail conditions. And then you could always also look at trip reports on the various internet forums like the Trails NH or the Facebook groups. And of course, there's the old standby and probably most reliable is guidebooks, just because the information's been vetted over time. So so those are your resources you have to work with. And then these are the 12 items, starting with temperature. So given that we're in the Adirondacks in the Northeast in the winter, we can expect cold temperatures. So we're not hot, we're not in the desert or anything like that. So we're going to want to pack accordingly for cold. And how cold? Well, that's where the government data comes in with the National Weather Service. They have climate data. So even though the forecast only goes out a week or 10 days, you can usually look at historical climate data and see usually how cold it is at night and daytime to get an idea of what to pack. And then as your trip gets closer, you can make some micro adjustments to your gear. And that's usually how I'll plan a trip. The next item there, precipitation, and we'll include with that anything that comes out of a cloud. So also some lightning. So I live out here in the Rockies in Colorado, and probably the worst time to be on a mountain is about 1 p.m. on a summer afternoon. So you take stuff like that into account. Obviously that doesn't apply specifically to the winter in the Adirondacks, but there's plenty of other precipitation types to deal with. I've seen snow on Marcy, freezing rain in Algonquin, something called Graupel on Cascade and Porter, and then a lovely thing called wintry mix, which is probably all those and everything in between. So you're pretty likely to get wet. Even when the forecast says there's only a 30% chance of precipitation, that in my experience means it's only going to precipitate 30% of the day. So you look at your forecast and your climate data and see what the clouds are going to do or not do and pack accordingly. The next item, daylight. So I think Michael already touched upon this briefly. It is winter. The sun sets pretty early and rises pretty late. You tend to have about 8.5 to 9 hours of daylight. In about a week from now, the days do start getting longer, gradually at first, and then by February, it'll really start to pick up steam, and you'll start to notice you'll have an extra hour or two of daylight by the time March rolls around. But given that, you do need to plan your hikes and your overnights based on how many hours of daylight you have to work with, given that you generally don't want to plan to hike at night. I mean, it's obviously possible with the right gear and headlamps and proper planning, but it's generally better to avoid that as part of your plan. If you have to do it, that's one thing, but so just consider the daylight, for your trip. And so I use this framework for every trip I plan, not just winter hikes. So for example, if it's summertime and I'm going to Alaska, the sun doesn't set, so I probably won't need a headlamp. So this kind of works both ways. This is a nice framework. It allows you to address every item along the way. And even though most of them might not seem to apply in every situation, but you'd be surprised some in the ways that they do. So, the next one, footing, is really applicable in this environment. There's snow, there's ice, there could be bare ground. It depends on the time of the day and month and year. So are you going to pack in micro spikes, crampons, snowshoes, or skis, or any and all the above? And that's where your trip reports come in handy. The guidebooks will often tell you if a trail is usually skiable, never skiable, if you'll frequently need crampons or seldom. So those are good sources of information that way. So you can at least pack the items you need and learn how to use them before you get into a situation that you're stuck in a spot that it's difficult to get out of because you didn't come prepared. This also applies in the summertime. So, if you're hiking on a nice smooth trail, you might just go out and trail runners. If you're on a rocky scree talus slope, you probably are going to think about bringing some ankle supporting boots. So this applies in all situations. The next thing, vegetation. Now that sounds like it would be a summer only thing. Like most people would think that would refer to, poison ivy or something like that. But, and I will illustrate this with a story from a few winters ago, and the name shall remain nameless, but we had planned bushwhack. This was in the Catskills, and it was winter, so we just assumed there would be not much vegetation in our path between our car and the summit. Well, the mountain laurel didn't listen to us, and it blocked our path for a couple miles. So there's always vegetation concerns if you're bushwhacking, for sure. And even if you're sticking to trails in the winter, what will often happen is if a trail is overgrown, and this is often mentioned in trip reports and guidebooks, after a snowstorm, all the branches will hang really low. And even though it's not currently snowing, you'll still get really wet because you'll be walking through the snow-laden path. So the vegetation matters. Navigational aids, this isn't referring to a compass per se, even though I use that as a symbol. This is referring to the how easily the terrain is to navigate. So can you see pretty far? And if you get disoriented, can you look at a distant ridge line or a distant lake and pick out some landmarks and just head towards that if you get lost? Or is it a really dense growth forest and you need some additional tools like a map and compass and maybe a GPS because you don't have the terrain navigational aids to guide you if you get off your trail or off your path. So that's just something to consider. This happens Sometimes above tree line in the winter is you'll have a beautiful, uh, uh, beautiful day, and then the clouds will come in, and you'll have almost zero visibility, and you're on pretty featureless rocky terrain without a whole lot of landmarks to go by because you can't see more than 30 or 40 feet. So consider how all these play together. So you have your terrain navigational aids, and then if your precipitation comes in and those two forces collide, now you have a situation that you hopefully plan for by bringing the extra tools and the knowledge of how to use a map and compass with a GPS, perhaps. So next item, sun exposure. This doesn't seem like it'd be a thing in the winter as much, but I've definitely gotten some pretty bad sunburns from having the sun reflect off the snow, off the bright white snow. So it's definitely a thing. It's more a thing out here in Colorado where skiers talk about getting their goggle tans and all sorts of things. But just keep in mind that sun exposure and sunburns are a concern year round if the sky is clear. So that's a pretty straightforward one. Water availability. This will determine how you pack and prepare for water. So if you have frequent water sources along your planned route, you might never need to bring more than 1 or 2 bottles to fill with water because you're going to see a stream or a lake or a pond every hour or two. If you're hiking in drier climates, you might need to bring 4 or 5 or 6 water bottles just to have that capacity to stock up between distant water sources. Generally, in the Adirondacks and in the winter, I've never gone more than 2 to 3 hours between water sources, and typically, because it's kind of a hassle to obtain water in the winter, it's often in creeks or lakes that have frozen over. I tend to just carry more than I otherwise would in the summer just because of the inconvenience of obtaining more of it. So it depends on the person. I typically carry 2 to 3 liters depending on my objective and how long I'm going to be out for. But water availability is certainly a factor to consider in how you're packing your pack and what types of water purification you're going to bring. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. So the next item here is problem wildlife. I put a picture of a mouse up there just because in my experience, they're far more problematic than the bears that are so often talked about. The great thing is in winter, bears are theoretically mostly hibernating. And in fact, the bear canister regulations from the DEC reflect that. So in this, I believe it's April 1st, November 30th, the DEC requires you to use a bear canister in the eastern high peaks of the Adirondacks. And then in the winter, December 1st to March 31st, that requirement is dropped, although they do make a statement that they encourage proper food storage, of course. So problem wildlife, how do you deal with that? If you're just out for a day hike, you're not going to be too concerned about storing your food because you're not camping. But you don't want to be running into mountain lions like we do out here in Colorado either. So you try to research the area you're hiking in and plan for what you might see. If you're in the Adirondacks, there are large animals there. Hopefully you see a moose because they do exist up there. The problem insects, this is a tick. They're generally not a concern in the winter, and neither are mosquitoes. In fact, this category pretty much goes away in the winter. There's really not much to speak to here. I can't, that's one of the best parts of, in my opinion, of hiking in the winter is this whole problem just goes away because of the extreme temperatures. The next thing is remoteness. I just threw Alaska up there because I figured what's more remote than Alaska. This is gonna affect how how thoroughly you plan. So and how the consequences of your plan not working. So if you're in the front country and close to civilization and a road and something goes wrong, you probably get a phone signal. Maybe it's only a mile out and you can extract yourself out of the woods and have a story to tell, but you'll probably be fine. But if you're in a really remote area where there's not help for miles, if not days, you need to plan to extract yourself if something goes wrong. And we'll talk about that more in the advanced trip planning seminar, which I believe is in March or February. I'm sorry, February. But I'll just mention that here to say that if you're doing something that's exceptionally remote, you need to be aware of that and be aware that you'll need to be more have more robust plans and be self-sufficient if you need to extract from the woods. And the last item is elevation. This plays in many ways. Like high elevation, you can be above tree line in the Adirondacks, so you'll be more exposed to the weather elements and more apt to hypothermia, etc. If you get out into the western mountains, elevation can also cause altitude sickness because the mountains out here are much higher. They're not 4,000 or 5,000 feet, they're 13,000 and 14,000 feet, which is very much an altitude at which people get altitude sickness. And a lot of people have used the Adirondacks and the Northeast mountains as a jumping off point to get into bigger objectives out west. So I do want to mention that here, and it is part of the planning framework, just to say that it's something to consider. And I think, looks like we had a couple of questions pop up. So
Yeah, John. So I answered one of them, which was just what was the footing icon about. But this second question gets at if you're wearing snowshoes, at what point do you switch to would you switch to crampons? Because in the Adirondacks, there's a requirement for wearing snowshoes with a certain amount of snow on the ground. So the question was, at what point do you switch from snowshoes to something more robust than micro spikes, like something to a crampon?
Right. So part of that is a judgment call that comes with experience. But the regulations are a good starting point for a guideline. So it does say snowshoes are required when there's 8 inches of snow on the ground, and I think they're going to up that to 12. Because you want to avoid post-holing, which can cause injuries, and it also ruin the trail for other people and trail users like skiers and snowshoers. So generally, as you get higher up in elevation, up the trail, the snowpack will often thin out because it's being scoured off by the wind. This usually happens at or above tree line. I will usually switch to crampons before it becomes absolutely necessary, because those are the spots that it's most awkward and inconvenient to sit down and change over your footwear. You don't want to be changing over footwear on a steep, slippery slope. You want to do it in a somewhat safe, ideally sheltered spot that you have some time to deal with your gear. So, and it happens gradually. I've not yet seen any spot where it'll just all of a sudden go from 2 feet of snow to 2 inches of snow. And snowshoes do have some mild crampons built into them, or at least most of them do. So the idea, if you're not on high angle terrain, you can often hike up moderate terrain in snowshoes because they do have some traction on the bottom. As it gets steeper or icier, then I will switch to crampons. Usually, I do like my micro spikes. They definitely have their place. Most the times though, if I'm going to stop and change over my footwear, I'm just going to go straight into crampons. If there's any significant amount of ice on the ground, just because they provide the best traction. If it's like one of those winter days where there's mostly rock and like a smattering of ice above tree line, that's really the ideal situation, I think, for microspikes, because you're mostly walking on rock with the occasional slippery patch of ice. But does that answer? I think.
Yeah, I think that gets at the question that was asked.
Yeah.
So
So
we can go to the next slide.
all right, next slide, please. All right, so after this is itinerary. So after we've kind of addressed the previous 12 items, we'll talk about a date and a time for our trip, and when do we want to go? When can we go? It's often more the latter. You know, most people can only get out at certain times during vacations or on the weekends. But if you have the choice, obviously you look at the weather forecast, you try to pick dates that will optimize your chance for success in the mountains. You go on days with better weather or later in the winter when there's more daylight. What time? Well, there's no substitute for an early start. So if you get a late start to the day, you're already starting from behind, so to speak, and it's hard to make up that time, especially in the winter when travel is generally slower to begin with, both on foot and driving to the trailhead. The travel details Michael pretty much covered before, but just to make sure you think about how you're getting to the trail or your hike. And usually this is driving. For bigger objectives, it will sometimes involve flying, to example, for some place like Seattle, so you can hike Mount Rainier. But just to get all those travel details worked out with the logistics of that. And we'll talk more about bigger trips in the advanced trip planning session. And then your route, you want to research your route so you know what to expect from point A to point B. This is where the trip reports come in handy, because they serve as a recent data source, a data point for what you can expect to see on the ground, be it 6 inches of snow or 2 feet of snow. And then you'll just see, and if you know what to expect, you know how to pack. So that kind of goes back to that previous snowshoe versus crampon question. And then you also know how to prepare. So if your route gains a lot of elevation steeply, you'll know you might need to be in better shape and have a fitness routine that will accommodate that. So, next slide.
Sure. So this is my piece, and so I could spend, we could spend a lot of time talking about clothing and gear. And while Jeremy's not aware of it yet, I'm going to propose that we actually put up a full clothing and gear session for people. There's a do-it-yourself gear piece that's later in the winter, but we can spend a lot of time talking about clothing and gear. So I'm going to hit on a couple of the key things to keep in mind with respect to trip planning. And then, we can either answer some questions that are more detailed, or we can see what we can do to try to get additional information out to everyone. The biggest thing is you want to control the sweat. Your sweat, you want to maintain a good temperature, and you want to dress in layers. I'm not going to talk about each of the individual pieces of clothing that make this up, but the idea is that your base layers are going to be close to your skin and wick the moisture away. Your middle layers are going to be what insulates you, and your outer layers are going to be what protects you from the elements. So depending on the type of trip you're taking, you may wear one, all, or some of these in different combinations. So when you think about clothing, you want to make sure that, one, there's no redundancy, and two, that everything fits over everything else. So while these aren't my actual pieces of clothing, I basically carry all of these items, and I can wear 1, 2, or all 3 of these boxes of clothes at the same time. And those would be under the worst possible conditions. So, knowing what your body temperature is, you'll know more about how you want to control your core temperature and how you're going to use the different layers that you're out with. So one of the things I did want to hit on real quick is that, if you're out there in the winter and you're using the same pack that you use in the summer, you either have too big a pack for the summer or too small a pack for the winter. Or I guess there's be a third option. If you carry all of this type of stuff with you in the summer, you're probably over prepared for summer. But there's a lot more stuff that you're going to carry with you. My summer pack is a 32 liter pack. And then in the winter, I bump that up to 58 liters because I've got all these extra items of clothing that I rarely wear. But if I need them, it's nice to know that they're in my pack. There's a lot of information out there with respect to what you need to have with you when you want to think about being safe and having a fun time. If you've hiked for any amount of time, you've heard of the 10 essentials. The picture here on the left, the Department of Environmental Conservation has taken the 10 essentials and kind of made them winter specific. So there's some different pieces of information in there related to winter travel. You can find that on the DEC website that we'll share with you in the resources link. There's also a plethora of different gear lists. I'm showing you the first page of the weekend day hike and the weekend backpacking trip that are on the Winter Mountaineering School page, winterschool.org. They're available to you guys to look at. The summer one is 4 pages long. The winter one is 5 pages long. And it goes into the very specific elements that you're going to want to have with you based on the type of trip. So you want to have those available. REI also does a great job, and they've got a lot of gear lists. And while I'm not shilling for REI, what I do like about the REI page is that if you click on an item, it will bring you to an example of what that particular item is. So you can kind of get a feel for what what they're talking about, like what's a balaclava, what's a face mask, those type of things. So you can kind of go back and actually see what's there. So get a gear list. I'll admit that when I first started winter hiking, I borrowed these items from the winter school page. I found them by accident. I had never even been to the winter mountaineering school, but I used the gear list, and I've modified it based off of my own experiences. But it's a great place to start if you're thinking about getting into winter and what do you need to bring with you. So one last thing on clothing and gear, and it's an important thing to realize that well, if you have all of the clothing and gear that you might need, you can go on all sorts of different trips. That doesn't mean that you can't get out in winter. You probably have stuff in your closet that may satisfy some of the needs for gear or clothing that you can try on those low and local trips where you're close to a road. I've had friends, I've told them to set up their new tent in their backyard and see how it handles the storm that's coming tonight, right? So you don't have to go out and spend a lot, but you want to make sure that once you do commit to it, that you get the right gear, for your trip. There are a couple other slides that I'm going to skip over that just kind of showed like some different piles of stuff. But like I said, what I'll do is we have the distribution for everyone that's on this call. And what I'll do is I'll work with Jeremy and the 80K, and we'll try to get you guys some more detailed information and maybe a video of what different gear looks like and that you want to factor into your bag. So with that, I'm going to go back to John, who is going to hit a little bit on nutrition and hydration.
Cool. Thank you, Michael. So nutrition, hydration, this is probably one of the most important aspects of winter hiking. It's just because of the increased needs of calories and hydration because of the dry winter air, and just because you're burning a lot more energy to cover ground in the winter. Yep, perfect. So nutrition, hydration. This was a delicious sandwich on the summit of something, who knows? But food, how much, what types? We'll cover resupplying in the advanced seminar. So this is an intro topic. So the assumption is you're not going to be in the woods for more than 3 or 4 days at a time. Once it starts to get beyond that length, then you need to think about how you're going to get to a grocery store or a post office to get your next supply of food. I'm going to mention recipes, but that will actually be talked about in the nutrition seminar on December 30th. Hopefully you can all get signed up for that if you're not already. And food storage, I kind of covered before with the rodents and the bears. Bear canisters are not legally required, but that doesn't mean they're not sometimes a good idea depending where you're camping. Typically though, in the winter, most people, including myself, will do a hang on a tree branch, similar to a bear hang, but not so much for the bears, but to keep your food away from the rodents, the pine martens, the mice, the animals that are kind of active throughout the winter. So it's a real bummer to wake up in the morning and have your food be gone or chewed through. And then that kind of ends your trip early and you might be a little hungry on the walk out. So can I?
Sorry, I stopped the share somehow. I clicked the wrong button.
It's
Here we
okay.
go.
I got it. In terms of how much food, I'll just say that most people will burn about 2,000 calories a day in their at home sitting still. It'll be 2 to 3 times that. So 4,000 to 6,000 calories for a good, honest, hard day's work in the mountains. So you want to pack your food accordingly in terms of calories. You want to bring stuff that does not have a high water content so it doesn't freeze. Typically things that have high fat contents also have a lot of calories. So blocks of cheese, nuts, salami, stuff like that. So that's also kind of covering what types of food you want to bring. You don't want to bring anything that requires extensive preparation. It's just too difficult to deal with in the winter. If it's cold, your hands don't have the agility, things freeze. You can do a hot meal at breakfast and at dinner, but usually throughout the day, you're moving consistently just because there's not much daylight and you need to keep moving to keep warm. Moving on to water, I kind of covered how much. I would say 2 to 3 liters of capacity is sufficient for most Northeast winter mountains. And the treatment for that is a little different in the winter. So in the summer, it seems like most people nowadays use the mechanical filters like the Sawyer or the MSR. Those freeze in the winter. So they have a severe shortcoming there. The traditional way to make water in the winter is to boil it to sterilize it. You can also use different chemicals like iodine or aquamira. They will take longer at colder temperatures, but they do work. All right, next slide.
Sure. So I sent a message out to everyone. We probably have about 15 more minutes of material. If you guys can stay on the line, great. If you have to drop off, thank you for participating. Just realize it is 9 o'clock right now. Well, 9 o'clock East Coast time. So I want to talk about the trip itself. And so I stole this list of trip checks from NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School. And while I'm not going to talk about each of the individual items that are on this list, these are the various points in a trip that you're going to want to step back and reassess your plan. The plan that you created in the cozy confines of your home and developed based off of what you anticipated or predicted, the weather, the trail conditions, the people that you were going to be with, were all factored into that original plan. However, as you go throughout the course of your trip, whether it's a 1 day or a multiple day trip, there are different times you're going to want to kind of go back and look at that plan to see whether or not it's still a good plan, or if it's not, what might need to be done to change it. Just wanted to hit on a couple of them that you can think about. Is the trailhead's an important time to make sure everyone's got the things that they said they were going to have. If you need to have snowshoes and crampons for a particular trip, and you show up and one of the people in your party, whether it's a formal or an informal trip, forgot their snowshoes at home or doesn't have any crampons or micro spikes or anything like that from a traction standpoint, it's a tough decision that has to be made, but will it affect the trip? Well, if you're going above tree line, it probably will. And do you want to take someone who's not prepared and put everyone else at risk, or how are you going to handle that? So, right off the bat, it's a good time to make sure everyone has the stuff that they said they were going to have with them. I actually had a trip where snowshoes and crampons were going to be required. And when we came time to, when we got to the time when it was, hey, we need to put on snowshoes. He had them, which was great. And then we needed to switch out of them to John's conversation earlier because the snow got a little more hard packed. He said, "Oh yeah, I didn't bring crampons. I forgot them, and I didn't think to tell you guys back at the trailhead." So we were in a very precarious situation by a waterfall, which was very slick because of the overflow, or not overflow, but the spray of water had frozen on the rocks, and we have someone who had old snowshoes without much crampon. So we should have addressed that at the trailhead. We tried to. He was not the type of person I talked about earlier, like compatibility. His goal was to hit the top of the mountain. So his goals were different than the goals of the rest of the group, which was to have a safe, fun trip. And we could have addressed that at the trailhead if we had figured that out. A couple of other things that are going to likely happen as things go on in the winter: time. It's going to take you longer to do different things. So if you've got a very tight time schedule and you say that you're going to be at a certain trail junction within an hour and a half, and it's 3 hours and you're still not at that trail junction, it's time to have a conversation with yourself and with the rest of the group and say, hey, we're behind schedule. How is that going to impact everything else that is dependent on us reaching certain milestones at a certain time? Do we need to go back? Do we need to adjust our plan? But those are conversations that you can have with the group. And I always tell the people that I try to train as instructors, those are conversations you want to start early on. You didn't get to the junction and just realize that you were 3 hours instead of an hour and a half. You knew all along that you were going to be late. So start that conversation early so people can start to get it in the back of their mind that we may have to adjust our plans so that it's not a shock to them when you stop and say, hey, what are we going to do? The only other one I wanted to hit on here is the weather and the environment. And the weather and the environment are probably the two things that will most likely change the most, that you have absolutely no control over. So you need to be having an eye on the weather. Even if there's a storm predicted later in the day, it might move in earlier. Or a storm that was supposed to clear out may linger. Those conditions may make the environment that you're in more difficult, whether it's a stream crossing that you have to navigate, whether it's a slippery area or a steep area where you might need to navigate with crampons versus snowshoes, or like in this picture, it may just mean low visibility. And what is that going to mean for the trip? And can you kind of stay together as a group? So these items that are on here as your trip checks are the specific times that you want to kind of say, okay, is my plan a good plan? And not that it was a bad plan when you put it together, but things have changed. How am I going to adjust that? And what am I going to do to make sure that my outcome is still the same? I get back to where I started in the same condition I started, but also I stay warm and dry. So these are the type of things that you want to incorporate not only in your written plan, but kind of as you're out there managing time, you want to keep an eye on these type of things as the trip progresses. And so I saw a question, was that taken care of? Okay. So let's go to the next slide then, which is you, John. And it's talking about, we got back home safe. What's the next step?
Yeah, so this is kind of the part that people don't usually talk about, but it's still important, is to look back at your trip. And you don't have to necessarily write a trip report, although if you're part of an organization, that's often for the whole process, but it helps you, a trip report will help you reflect on what happened, what you learned, what you could have done better, and what went well. And every trip I've ever taken, there's always something I would do different next time. There's always something to learn. That's the cool thing about the mountains, is they're there to teach you something. And even every trip is a little different. There's different weather, there's different people, there's different gear. There's always some variables. You can never anticipate everything. And it's kind of fun to look back and see what you learned. And if you write this stuff down, like in a journal, you can go back years later and be like, oh, wow, this is fun to look at. I thought that back then, and now I obviously don't. So, and And then you have to clean and dry your gear and store it properly. So there's a photo there of my nice gear explosion in my living room with way too many boots and crampons. This is probably a common sight in many of your houses, I would imagine, much to the annoyance of your family or significant other. But it's an important step to get everything dried out. You don't want mildew and mold growing on this often expensive gear because it's impossible to get out. And you don't want to have to replace stuff just because you didn't take care of it properly. So clean it, dry it. There's special detergents for down that you can put in the washing machine. There's special detergents for waterproof coats. Make sure everything gets dried out, your tent, your sleeping bag, things don't like to be wet. And then when you put stuff away, put it away dry and clean. And your sleeping bag, don't put it away compressed. Put it away big and fluffy. They're happier that way. And then, plan for your next trip. Get stoked, get excited, because the more success you have in the mountains, the more you're gonna keep going back and have more fun the next time. It's just I won't call it a vicious cycle, but it's a fun cycle. With that, I think we're on the last slide, which is our list of resources.
Yeah, so it's the schedule, but I just wanted to hit on one thing,
Oh,
John.
schedule.
I was telling John the other day is that lower left corner is one of the things I'm most guilty about. My gear storage tends to be my car. And so even though we converted one of the kids' bedrooms when they moved out into a gear room, I tend to leave the stuff in the car for a day or two too long. And, it definitely, it's a skill that I still am working on, almost 425 or so winter summits. I still leave my wet stuff in my car after a winter trip. So this, the next slide, and I saw somebody posted that all of the events are full, but this is the upcoming schedule of online learning sessions. What we are going to try to do is record them and make them available to people that didn't participate. Obviously, the Q&A chat feature won't be available, but we are trying to figure out ways to get this information to as many people as possible. The next session is, as John mentioned earlier, the hydration, nutrition, and meal planning, which is on December 30th. And then while there are other sessions, I kind of highlighted the 3 or 4 that kind of apply to the type of stuff that we talked about today, with mountain weather on January 20th. The advanced trip planning that John mentioned a couple times is February 3rd. My talk with a couple of other people on wilderness risk management is February 17th. And then that do-it-yourself gear talk is on March 3rd. And then the last slide I'll share with you guys before going to the question answer box, if we have anything, is, and this will be part of what we make available to you guys, is there's a number of resources out there that are available to kind of dig in deeper to the type of stuff that we talked about. The winterschool.org is the Winter Mountaineering School's home. There's a student handbook that is available, as well as those different gear lists that I showed just a screenshot of. Those are available. The student handbook has a lot of great information about boots and weather and clothing, and meal and nutrition and hydration stuff. So definitely check that out. And then the other things on there are some various books that are out there by either the Mountaineers, the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Adirondack Mountain Club. A couple of my personal favorites are at the bottom of that list. 2 books by a friend of mine, Ty Gagney. We're both insurance risk managers, so the risk decision-making process. But both of those events, books relate to events that happen in the winter. So if you're looking for some, what are the things that you need to think about during winter, those are two great resources as well. So we'll make sure that we share that with everyone as well. So John, I don't know if you had anything to add to this, or if you just wanted to go to the question answer chat box.
Let's go to Q&A, and Jeremy can wrap it up for us.
So it looks like there's a virtual learning weather program that
we're actually doing a mountain weather presentation in January.
Good deal.
And myself and one of my esteemed colleagues will be presenting that one.
Perfect.
So kind of a couple wrap up things, which if you want to get a question in now, by all means, go for it. But if you enjoyed this tonight, please come and check us out at winterschool.org. We've got a ton of information on our website about our more traditional programs that we offer. We fully hope that we will be back live in person at the Adirondack Lodge in Winter School 2022. But we kind of screwed up a little bit and intended for these courses not to fill up, and it turns out that they did. Everybody's stuck at home and they all filled up very quickly. So all of these courses are being recorded live. And what we hope to do, and we're kind of going to revisit this after we get through the holidays, is publish either all of them or some of the more popular ones either on our website or on our Facebook page, which our Facebook page, if you'd like to go and join it, is WMS alumni. Now that you've all attended a course for Winter Mountaineering School, you're an alumni of the Winter Mountaineering School. But in all seriousness, we do anticipate getting this info. Our goal is to get this information out to anybody that wants to get it, or to keep us not only at the top of people's minds, but we'd like to see some of the participants of our online learning this winter at Winter School 2022, when I will gladly no longer be the director and have gotten to pass it on to somebody else. But if there's no other questions, unless you guys have anything else at this point, we'll call it an evening. Everybody stay safe and enjoy the winter. It's getting snowy on the east, and it's slowly starting to get snowy out here on the west in California. The skiing's about to get ripping.
So I was just going to add, Jeremy. So, if you do have Facebook and you do join the 80K, the Winter Mountaineering School alumni page with all the rights and privileges that are now bestowed upon you as participants. I know that I'm on there, and I know that Jeremy is, and John, I think you have something as well. So if you want to reach out to us individually through that platform to ask us for more detailed information about maybe something that we talked about, definitely don't hesitate. I'm speaking for Jeremy and John.
I'm very rarely on Facebook. The best way to reach out to us is on our website. We have a message page, or you can send us a message, and the current director, assistant director, and then a handful of other people that are regularly involved in the program all receive that email, and we can respond. One of the big questions, I assume, will be where to view future or the rest of the presentations that you weren't lucky enough to sign up for. That information will be posted to our website and our Facebook page very soon, probably in the next month or so.
Any more questions out there?
Doesn't look like it.
Going once.
All right, everybody have a good evening. Pray for snow.
Yeah, more snow.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you all for your time. Have a great night.